service. Arlyne and I worked with them on helping them think about how they could look at their Monarch butterfly program and think about evaluation questions and turn it into a plan. So we're excited to share with you what we did. And maybe just before we get into the presentation itself, it might make sense to have each one here present themselves briefly and just tell you a little bit about their role in this work. So maybe let's go in the order that we have on the slide. Could I ask you, Mark, to introduce yourself first, please?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Chase. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, part of the National Wildlife Refuge System, and I'm the director of the Refuge System Science Center in Fort Collins, Colorado.
Okay, great. Christy?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Christy Browne, and I'm a conservation social scientist. And I was formerly in the refuge system, working in the same office as Mark. I now sit in international affairs.
Great, thanks. Arlyne?
Okay, thanks, Caroline. I'm Arlyne Johnson. I work with Foundations of Success. I'm based in Madison, Wisconsin, and had the pleasure of working with this team on helping facilitate the process of moving them through their conservation questions into evaluation design. Thanks.
Great, thanks. And I am Caroline Stem. I also work with Arlyne at Foundations of Success. I'm based in upstate New York, and I also had the pleasure to support this project. So let's talk about what we are going to cover today. We're first going to describe a little bit how U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service came, well, first the monarch story itself, why monarchs are important and what the service is hoping to achieve. And then we'll talk a bit about how they decided to use the conservation standards and the process that we then use to help them think about their conservation questions and turn them into an evaluation design. And then we'll conclude with some lessons learned and next steps. And I think there will be opportunity too for questions. Terry, I think did you want to say anything about questions or how to handle that?
Sure, sorry. Yes, we'll wait for questions to the end. And if you do have a question along the way, drop it in chat and I'll be monitoring that and we'll take those in the order that they come in. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark Chase at this point.
Yeah, get our next slide up there. So a little bit of background, how the Fish and Wildlife Service got into the monarch butterfly business. Most of you are probably very aware of the sustained decades decline of both the eastern migratory population from Canada, the United States, Mexico, and the western population in the United States that winters along coastal California. Dramatic declines, like I said, as most of you are aware, and our director at the time took an interest in this, and his motivation was not only preserving this incredible natural phenomenon, but also he saw the monarch as being that catalyst to really engage the next generation of conservationists. He said, you know, we're all familiar with it. We all learn about migration in school, and we talk about the monarch butterfly. And with that, you know, the emphasis within the service to take some deliberate, explicit actions on monarch conservation was shortly after that. Again, as most of you are aware, we were petitioned to list the monarch butterfly under the Endangered Species Act, which starts the regulatory process that our endangered species people in the Fish and Wildlife Service are undertaking. And so that began. At the time, concurrently with that, monarchs were clearly a priority for our director. They became a priority for the secretary. They became a priority for the president. And through the Trilateral Committee, a priority for Canada, Mexico, the United States as well. So that's kind of how we got into, real quickly, how we got into the monarch business. And so going back to when go to the next slide there, Caroline, thank you. So going back to when our director asked us to engage in this, we did kind of what we always do. We gathered up a bunch of biologists and we locked them in a room and we gave them a couple of outreach people. And we said, you know, make a plan for how we're going to conserve monarch butterflies. And we did that on a 5-year basis and it was very comprehensive. I think it was a good work plan. It involved a number of partners, a number of non-traditional partners for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and addressed a number of comprehensive things that we thought were impacting monarch butterflies: rights of way management, use of private land, agricultural practices, all those sorts of things. But as you can imagine, when we do this, like we always do with a bunch of biologists and one outreach person, there were some questions that some people started asking that we couldn't answer. We clearly needed a different process. And so for that, I'll turn it over to Christy.
Okay, I'm gonna let Christy drive this.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So Mark gave you a little bit of background of how the service got started. And by the time I came along, the activities had already been, the planning and the activities had already been underway for about a year. And then in early 2016, Mark asked me to join a call with the service's Monarch Conservation leadership team. And you know, as I said, at this point in time, I hadn't had any involvement in the Monarch Initiative and had very little knowledge of the plight of the butterfly or the related activities of our agency. So on that call, oops, it's not advancing, there it goes. The team asked me a couple of questions. First, what should our social objectives and outcomes be? And how do we know if we're having the desired impacts? Well, without having any context, I didn't have any specific answers to those questions. And as Mark mentioned, this has been a common story for us and in conservation in general. So what often happens is an issue is identified, we become aware of a species or ecosystem that is being put at risk, then strategies are selected and implemented, and these may be strategies that we routinely use or have used in the past, or perhaps just strategies that we feel most skilled at implementing. And this is often done without developing or else being explicit about our understanding of the context within which the issue is occurring. And also without being explicit about how strategies are expected to lead to our desired conservation outcomes. So in advising on the social aspects and the evaluation of the service's monarch conservation efforts, I needed to understand this context, as well as the strategies that were being implemented and their related objectives. So first, yay, as a social scientist, I was so excited we were thinking about our social objectives. As we all probably know, most instances of environmental decline are ultimately the result of human activity, and that social factors often determine the success or failure of conservation interventions. So conservation social science, my field, offers tools for helping to understand conservation context, that orange oval on the previous slide, and can provide information needed to design, implement, and evaluate conservation interventions. So in the case of Monarch, social science can answer questions such as, what are the social drivers within the socio-ecological context of monarch conservation? And who are the related stakeholders, and how are they affected, or do they affect the issue? And what is the current knowledge, and what are the attitudes and the beliefs and the behaviors of stakeholders? And what are those desired social outcomes that the leadership team was asking about? And we'll come back to these questions a little later. So for the second question posed by the leadership team, I was also really excited to be talking about how to formally evaluate the effectiveness of our conservation actions. And this is really a reflection of a growing call for greater accountability and transparency in conservation. An evaluation is also a critical element of adaptive management. And the social sciences offer a variety of methods for assessing the social objectives and outcomes of conservation efforts. So when faced with complex issues and when we have incomplete knowledge and lack of clear solutions, adaptive management is a great framework, and that allows us to take action and to systematically test assumptions in order to learn and adapt. So a question my social science colleagues and I often hear is, at what point in a project should social science be considered or integrated? And the answer is, ideally from the beginning. Throughout a project cycle, social science can provide answers to those questions I outlined a few moments ago. So back to that phone call. The leadership team briefly described our agency's monarch conservation strategies for me, but I needed more information to start to answer those two questions. So I asked a couple of questions of my own. Starting with, why are we trying to conserve monarchs? What is the problem exactly? And what are we trying to achieve with the strategies we have in place? In other words, why are we doing what we're doing? As they responded, I drew a diagram on a whiteboard in Mark's office, trying to connect the dots. I wrote words such as neonics and rights of way, which I had never heard before. And we added human activities such as pesticide application, mowing, and gardening. So as you may have guessed, what I was doing was trying to assess the problem or map out the socio-ecological context in which monarchs exist, that orange context oval. You are all familiar with this step of the conservation standards and adaptive management in general. And so the beauty of this particular framework to me is that it provides guidance and specific tools for each stage of the project cycle. So after that call and looking at the results of my quick and dirty situation analysis that day, the leadership team decided a more systematic, in-depth analysis was needed. So a couple of months later, we held a monarch planning workshop where we worked through the assess step. Participants came from all over the country and included personnel from across the agency's regions and programs and represented varied areas of expertise. So given that our agency had been working on monarch conservation for some time, we were not starting from scratch at the workshop. We had implicit and explicit knowledge, we had objectives, and we had already defined our intended biological outcome. So our task was then twofold. First, to explicitly define the socio-ecological context in which monarch conservation occurs, so that we could ensure that our existing strategies were indeed addressing the highest priority threats to monarchs in the most effective way. We also discussed some potential new strategies that may fit into that context. And second, we needed to articulate that information in a systematic way so that we could test our assumptions or measure the impacts of our current strategies. At the workshop, we also took a shot at developing a preliminary set of results chains representing how we thought our strategies would work. But it soon became apparent that we needed some more facilitation, some expert facilitation to further refine the assumptions in our conceptual model and to start developing a formal evaluation plan. So to tell you about that, I'm going to turn it over to Arlyne.
All right.
Okay, great. Thanks, Christy and Mark, for that background. And so great. So what we're going to talk about next is, given that context that Christy and Mark just shared with you, we can just flip on to the next slide. We're going to describe the process that we all work through together to develop the evaluation plan. So in this section of the presentation, we'll provide you with a little bit more detail on the plan step of the conservation standards. That was also done, as Christy and Mark have said, retroactively, because as we said, the service was already implementing these actions. And thus the purpose here we had to stay focused on was to evaluate the effectiveness of what was being done and not developing a strategic plan for what should be done. And then we'll talk about how the core team used their retrospective theories of change to identify evaluation questions and the methods for data collection analyses that resulted in the final evaluation plan. So going on to the next slide, after the team refined their situation analysis, the next step was to prioritize which of their strategies they were going to evaluate to test out and refine, because they really wanted to test out and refine the conservation standards-based methodology in this first phase of evaluation. So you can see the criteria on the screen here that they used to do that prioritization. These were strategies that they were currently implementing that were really major investments for the service, and strategies that they really expected would reduce highest ranked threats to monarchs, and realistically strategies on which data could easily be collected to assess impact and progress to date. So on this next slide, then we see the 6 strategies that they prioritized. We'll just go through them very quickly. So in the evaluation, they're looking at this first strategy, which is one to prioritize service actions to geographies in the country that maximize the likelihood of effective monarch conservation. This was a prerequisite to all their other strategies. The second one also was a prerequisite. It's a multi-sector approach with relevant groups and agencies across North America to leverage resources and expertise. The third here is how the service works with private landowners to increase and enhance monarch habitat. The fourth is their outreach work to increase public awareness of the threats to monarchs and mobilize people to take action. And the fifth is the work that they do with road and railway systems, utility corridors to create and enhance a habitat to support monarch production on those areas. And the final one is work on service lands, national wildlife refuges and fish hatcheries to provide high quality monarch habitat. So that was the parameters as we went into the evaluation design. So then the team retrospectively developed theories of change for each of these prioritized strategies that they intend to help them focus the evaluation on testing their assumptions and assessing the impact of these actions. The next slide just talks briefly here about how generically developing theories of change, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this and have done this process, developing theories of change helps a team to pinpoint areas of uncertainty and risk where their logic may not hold or where external factors may influence the team's ability to achieve the intended results. So this can help teams ask answerable, decision-relevant questions to gather the evidence they need for adaptive management. So here's our first example. They may need to have a better understanding of context in which they're working. What factors other than those in the theory of change may be influencing whether a result occurs. Secondly, they frequently want to know whether one result is leading to another and the conditions under which this is the case or not. And thirdly, whether a result was achieved. Did our actions contribute to the desired result? And importantly, why or why not? So from there then, looking at that generic example, let's look at an actual example of these types of questions from the Monarch evaluation plan. So what you're seeing here is a portion of the theory of change that describes how the service is working with private landowners to increase and enhance monarch habitat. And you can see the assumptions are the establishment of a relationship with landowners will lead then to landowners having a positive attitude towards engaging in land management practices, and then the landowner ultimately making a decision to take that conservation action. So as an example of questions here, here's our first one. To understand context, one of their questions was, what influences landowner decisions to acquire more knowledge on best management practices? A second question was to, in this case, assess whether one result was leading to another. Is knowledge and understanding of BMP's best management practices associated with landowner beliefs and attitudes about taking action? If not, why not? And thirdly, our third question example here was to determine if a result was achieved. Does the outreach by the Fish and Wildlife Service in its various forms influence conservation actions by landowners? So that just gives you an example of the types of questions that the team generated. In the next slide, we're going to dig a little deeper, and for each one of these evaluation questions that they developed, the team also considered the following points. How would that evidence generated from answering that question be used for decision making to inform adaptive management, which was Christy's point at the beginning? What data and analysis would be needed to answer the question? And then ultimately, what's the feasibility of answering the question? And so from there, to get at that, we used this spreadsheet where we entered the final wording for each one of the questions that the team had developed. And then from there, in this next column, we thought about the management decisions. Why are we asking this question? We documented that. What will we do differently if we can answer the question? And then thirdly, thought about, did some ranking on how feasible it would be to answer the question. And we really found that these last two criteria were really key to helping the team prioritize their evaluation questions as we went through this process. Okay, so then we dug a little deeper even, and for each of those strategies, we populated a separate spreadsheet like this to clarify what data was needed to actually answer each question. And so you can see for this one question about the association between BMPs and beliefs and attitudes, they were able to define the specific groups of landowners they needed to analyze to answer this question. And they looked at the specific variables they needed to find out about landowner knowledge and understanding of BMPs, as well as possible other influencers. And then as far as data sources, we found with this particular example, and as you'll find with some evaluation questions, some of that data had already been compiled. There was already existing evidence from other studies. And so in this particular example, when they asked the question, do we need to collect external data, the last column in this spreadsheet, because some of the data had been compiled or there was some existing evidence, for this particular question, they may not need to collect any new data. For other questions, definitely new data was needed. So this was the detailed process that the team went through to dig down for each of these evaluation questions. So moving on then to the next slide, after we completed this exercise, the team still had more questions than were feasible to answer during this first phase of evaluation. So we did another step in prioritization across questions across all 6 strategies. And here you can see those criteria that they considered for that prioritization. What was the perceived degree of uncertainty around that question, and especially the level of risk associated with not knowing the answer or getting it wrong made it a priority, and the feasibility of collecting the data. And here you see that kind of dot voting exercise that they did as a partial approach to working through this. And on the final piece of the evaluation plan components, then, just to give you a heads up, there is a public version now of the evaluation plan that this team put together. It was completed in August 2019, and Mark and Christy can tell you more about accessing that. It doesn't contain all the details we've shared with you today, but it contains these components that resulted from that work of the evaluation team. So you can see there's a definition of each strategy, there's an annotated results chain and a narrative, and then these points about why are they asking that question, what will they do with that information, the data needs and sources and references. And that's the details. Now I'm going to turn it back to Christy and Mark, who are going to share their reflections on the process and the next steps in this Monarch evaluation plan.
All right, thank you, Arlyne. Yeah, Christy, are you up on this one? Christy's got her mute going.
Oh, sorry, I was waiting for the screen to get shared with me.
Oh, is it not being shared right now?
No.
We've got it.
Oh, you want me to stop and you are presenting again?
Oh, no, you
No,
go
okay.
ahead. That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Sorry about that. So one of the key results or lessons learned from applying the conservation standards to our monarch conservation efforts is that the process and the tools of the conservation standard helped us answer these questions posed by the leadership team when we were already knee-deep in implementation. So for the first question, it helped us understand the social drivers of monarch decline, such as consumer preferences, beliefs and attitudes, and identify the key stakeholders associated with those drivers, including private landowners, as you saw with Arlyne's example, urban communities, the agricultural sector, and other government agencies, to name a few. And this information led to the identification of several desired social outcomes, with the key one, as in most conservation efforts, being changing human behaviors across all of the different contexts within which, you know, these threats are occurring. In the case of monarchs, this includes affecting different land uses and management actions such as pesticide use, mowing, and gardening. And for the second question, as you've seen, we were able to address a key component of adaptive management, and that's evaluation. And so we now have that formalized plan. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Unmute. Okay, so quickly for me, this was my first experience with these particular tools, and I really found it to be helpful for me. And what I really liked about it is the transparency of the communication tool of where an organization fits, you know, how an organization stays in their lane. One of the things with monarchs specifically in the United States, you know, a huge influence is the price of corn, wheat, and soybeans in a given year has a tremendous impact on how much grass and flowers are in the middle third of the United States. And of course, that's not anything that the Fish and Wildlife Service has anything to do with. So it's a good communication tool, I think, to the model, framing out the context, being very explicit, and it becomes pretty obvious, aligning with missions and authorities of where organizations can plug in. And then I think the other part that I really appreciated out of this was the results chains being so explicit from each step, because I think the assumption for a long time, we've tended to think, you know, well, we'll have an open house and we'll educate people and then they'll change their behavior. And, you know, there's a lot more steps in between there, and the formal evaluation and the thinking through of that process, I think, is really invaluable. Challenges, I think we learned a lot from this. For our organization, it was something that was new, and so that was different. We got a lot of pushback that took a little while to understand, but we got a lot of pushback from a number of people, and finally I kind of rooted that out, and it got to the SDM people, the structured decision making people, looked at this as a competing method. And, you know, finally, some of them told me, they said, we don't do that, we do SDM. And so there was a good thing to know that the next time we enter into this, we kind of talk about how those can really be complementary processes. One of the big challenges for us is we had what was called our species status assessment process going on. And that's the legal regulatory backdrop of our responsibilities under the Endangered Species Act when we were petitioned to list the monarch. And so there was some angst there that our process might compromise this, looking at these social factors and influences and evaluation might compromise what was going on there. And we dealt with that by just being communicating a lot, and also putting people on the teams that were on both. And so that we didn't have two separate conversations going. We had a great deal of overlap between the people that were on the SSA team and the people that worked with us on this. The other challenge that we figured out why we had Arlyne and Caroline is there's a need for specialized skills that we really don't have a deep bench on in the Fish and Wildlife Service. So that was a challenge. And then I think finally just talking about, when we talk about the word evaluation, I think that's scary and threatening to some folks. People in a lot of things kind of like, I've always been doing this, you know, just let me have my budget and leave me alone. And when we start asking these really specific questions, some folks tend to get a little bit nervous about that. It's like, you know, how do you know that you know, you're going to make a public service announcement? How are you going to know if it worked? And thinking through that, I think is incredibly valuable for any organization. But also there is some institutional resistance because for most folks it's new. And so I think there's quite a bit of stuff there. Hopefully you all have some questions, but I'm going to turn it back over to Caroline to close this out. Oh, next steps. I'm sorry. So what do we do next? We have this evaluation plan. We still have these teams. What we have done is because of the plight of pollinators, insects in general, in addition to monarchs across really globally, we've merged kind of our monarch effort into a larger all pollinator effort. We have a number of teams dealing with partnerships, different sectors of the economy, different groups. And what we've done is we've asked those teams to take the relevant strategies, the relevant results chains out of our evaluation plan and actually work those into their workloads. Specifically, are we managing our national wildlife refuges, lands under our statutory responsibility? Are we considering pollinators? Are we maximizing pollinator habitat? Is our private lands program doing what we intend it to do? Are they putting in projects that are explicitly for pollinators? Are we explicitly considering pollinators when we put in a project that's primary purpose might be ducks? Those kind of questions we've given to those teams, and we hope to have, you know, within a year, some information start emerging that yes, our actions are actually doing what we intend them to do. So with that, back to Caroline.
All right. So I don't have anything more to add except maybe just to thank Mark and Christy for sharing their story and for inviting Arlyne and me to be part of it. So it was really a fun and interesting new process for us all. And thank Terry and the CCNet North American franchise for setting this up, and all of you who've come here and sat here and listened. It's great to be sharing this with you. So I guess, Terry, I'll turn it back to you for questions and answers.
Yes, great. If you stop sharing your screen, then we can see everybody.
All right.
Great. Yep. Those that are on, and we've got a couple questions here. So from John Morrison, for Arlyne, were you tempted or did you discuss developing retrospective situation analyses as part of the process? I could see how it might help suss out some of the success failure factors related to strategies.
Sure. And we can all maybe make some comments on this. Thanks, John, for that question. And yeah, actually, we didn't spend a lot of time to describe this, but as Christy described, their team before Caroline and I came on to work with them had a situation analysis that they had drafted. And we actually did spend, once Caroline and I were working with their team, we spent, I guess probably 2-3 months working with them virtually to actually do that, to refine that retrospective situation analysis. And a lot of that had to do with some questions about, they were looking at Eastern populations, Western populations, were the drivers different, digging down into, as you said, some of those other factors that might be really affecting what would work, what wouldn't. And that then was carried into those retrospective theories of change. So they did look at those factors and did bring those in. So I'll let Caroline or Mark or Christy, if you want to add anything to that.
Oh, I think you covered it.
I would just add that, yeah, building on what Mark had said earlier, we don't have, or at least we didn't know of at the time, many people in the service who have the skill set to facilitate a situation analysis and use the Marathi software as well. But we do have some people, but their time is limited. So we had someone by the name of Jenny Duberstein lead us in our initial, that initial workshop, and she started a Marathi file for us, but it did need refinement by the time Caroline and Arlyne came along.
Thank you. Next is from Josh. Does anyone have a way to bring in the commonality synergies to work with DSF folks? I could use a tool for that in my toolbox since I work with some strong DSF advocates.
Can you, I'm sorry, I'm not catching on to what DSF is.
That's the structured decision making, right?
Oh, structure and
Okay.
decision making. Okay, right. Caroline, do you want to have any, we have talked about that, about how that works into overlap with certain steps of the open standards.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of this, just in case people aren't aware. In the version 4.0 of the conservation standards, there's a brief section about the relationship of the conservation standards to other systems like structured decision making. And because I know that has, and as Mark was saying too, that was an issue where people said, no, we use structured decision making, not this process. And I think that there are tools in both boxes. I actually personally see the conservation standards as a structured decision-making process. We're going through steps and helping teams make decisions and prioritization. And are there other tools we can add? Absolutely. And so I think this probably isn't really a great answer to your question, Joshua, but I think it's understanding the audience and finding out which tools will work for them. And it might be using some of the conservation standards tools, but then bringing in other tools like consequence tables or other structured decision-making tools that really can help teams move through some sticky spots.
And I might just add to that, one of the ways we've used structured decision making with some teams is in that strategy selection part of the conservation standards, where, you know, and I think there were even some workshops on that at the conservation coaches rally on using structured decision making tools to help refine that strategy selection, which could be very helpful.
Anyone else on that?
I think I'll just jump in real quick because this addressed, Doug had a similar question.
Yep, exactly. Good. Thank you.
I think the thing for us became, it wasn't really the message, it was the messenger. And so some of the folks that had been in the SDM world and were very familiar with that and very proficient and comfortable going through that process, when they understood that these were not mutually exclusive things and that they could, there were places for that, we let them talk about it, and that helped a great deal with our workforce.
Great. And just I'll read what Doug said, and then there's another comment about the same process. So, is the sense of competition between CS and SDM new in Fish and Wildlife Service? Seems like both approaches have been promoted for some time, years, and there may be a lot of Fish and Wildlife Service staff who understand both, who could help identify complementary roles. And then Megan said, I left Fish and Wildlife Service in 2011, and the sense of, quote, competition between SDM and conservation standards was alive and well even then.
So I think we're getting better. Just as we have more understanding and people go through the processes, I think we're a lot better off now than we were certainly 10 years ago with the acceptance and understanding that.
Great. It's really good to hear. Anything else on that concept? I've got another fun fact from Christina. Christina, can you come off mute and pronounce the ingredients that you want? Because I'm not sure I can do it justice.
Sure. Hello. So in Michoacan and the state of Mexico, that's in central Mexico where the monarchs go every year, there is a pre-Hispanic belief that the monarchs represent the spirits or the souls of our loved ones who have just temporarily moved to Mictlan, which is where spirits rest. And then they come back to visit their loved ones once a year. And it coincides with All Saints, I think you say in English. So then it was mixed with Catholicism and other things, but it's really a pre-Hispanic tradition. And since I have the mic, I have a question. I'm wondering how we can continue to improve the way that we tackle the needs of species like the monarchs that span our human invented boundaries of countries and cultural divisions. Because, for example, in Mexico, sadly, we are not doing a good job at conserving the habitat. We continue to lose monarch habitat to illegal avocado groves. And so there's a whole market-based situation going on, and also an organized crime scenario and lack of governance, which sadly, we have lost environmental colleagues who work in the environment because there's such an interest in that habitat for us, but then organized crime also wants to reap the benefits of their illegal activities there. So I'm just wondering, how can we factor these things in, because these wide-ranging species need us to think from those angles.
Let's tackle that at least first about the monarch. Mark and Christina, is there cooperation and collaboration with Mexico on the monarch?
Go ahead, Christy.
Oh, I was just going to say, yes, we've, I actually attended the Trilateral Committee meeting. It's been almost 2 years ago now, and the Monarch, and that's the meeting, annual meeting between Canada, Mexico, and the United States to talk about various issues of conservation concern. And the Monarch has been on that agenda for several years. I don't know how long. I've been with the service for 5 years, and I don't know if it spans back any further before I joined, but yes, I mean, that's a mechanism or a platform for the countries to do some coordinated planning and discussions.
So when it was out of the Trilateral, at least we have a common goal, and that's an overwintering population in Mexico of 6 hectares. They measure the population of butterflies by how many hectares they cover. And that arose out of the Trilateral meeting of the executive committee. So that's our best forum. What we're trying to do now, because we have some pretty robust partnerships dealing with migratory birds, trying to make sure that the bird conservation efforts and monarchs in the back of their minds, and trying to leverage those existing partnerships, because those extend from Canada into Mexico. And so we're trying to keep it on the forefront of their thought as well.
Yeah, and for some of the other pieces that Christina was talking about, I would call a lot of that the human dimensions, my field, or conservation social science. And I think it's really important to understand those varied contexts over this large geographic area. So you have these cultural beliefs that you're talking about, and that's, if you think in terms of the conceptual model from indirect threats and opportunities, that's a real opportunity perhaps to engage communities to be champions for monarchs or monarch conservation. But I mean, that's obviously different in the United States. So it's trying to get that understanding and how, you know, people think about different conservation issues, different species. And then in addition to their beliefs and feelings about things, or what are some of those contextual issues as far as economics or policy and so forth. Does that answer your question?
Those are great ideas and thoughts on how to tackle those. Do other folks have other issues? And in fact, actually, Paulina wrote in the chat that thinking about traditional knowledge and cultural value and incorporating that into the strategy is important. So thinking about taking some of those lessons from Mexico and bringing that into the situation is another great idea. Other thoughts that folks have, since we've got 30 coaches on here who do some of this work around North America and the world? Tough issues. Well, are there any other questions for our panelists? Oh, beautiful article and with images and sounds about monarch migration in the latest New Yorker. Thank you. That's great to capture that and take a look at that. Well, we really appreciate everybody's time and attention here. I'll give it just another minute. If somebody wants to raise their hand in the chat and has another question, feel free to do so. I really also appreciated hearing a story that's, we often hear the beginnings of a process, right? Here's the plan, we're thinking about doing something. We haven't tried anything yet, so we don't know how effective it might be. It's really refreshing to hear you all talk about kind of more at the latter end where you've been implementing and now you're evaluating. And so I think that was especially helpful today. The resource, the National Monarch Conservation Evaluation Plan, is that available on the website?
That'd be a question for Christy or Mark, where to find that.
If you all are familiar, we have our service library where we put stuff as harvested by what's called data.gov, and that is publicly accessible. And so that would be the place that it is available. And otherwise we can maybe provide that through Terry or
that'd be great.
Mine and Arlyne for folks on this call if you'd like to go through it.
Great. If anybody has trouble finding it, if you Google it and can't quite find it, let me know and I can check back in with Mark and Christy and make sure we can get it. One more question. All right. Do you feel like you have a team at Fish and Wildlife Service that could now launch other conservation management planning using the conservation standards?
What do you think, Christy?
Yeah, I was just unmuting to talk about something that we're still working on with Arlyne and Caroline. So what we built into the original contract with them is when we got to the end of this process to reconvene a subgroup to talk about how can we transfer this process to other efforts in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we are still working together. Actually, Caroline and Arlyne are doing the brunt of this, developing, it's a quasi-report / guidance document that outlines the process we went through, and as just to teach people how it works with a real world example that makes sense to people in our organization. And we are having internal conversations about, you know, can we take that document and use it in the new course on the conservation standards at the National Conservation Training Center, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Training Center for all different kinds of things. So yes, we're trying to have some diffusion of innovation going on, have it spread.
Great.
Yeah.
There's a few comments in the chat. We have done a coaches training at NCTC, and John Morrison, who leads those efforts, is like, should we do another one there? And there's promotion for whooping cranes from Erica, who's with the Crane Foundation, or red knots. So lots of interest from this group in helping with that process as well. So well, I'm sure we'll check back in with you all. Well, thank you all so much for the presentation. Really appreciate your time here, and I'm going to stop the recording.